Hello and welcome. In this masterclass, we're going to dive deep into the fundamentals of neuroanatomy, based on the brilliant work of Associate Professor Dennis Berry. Think of this as our guided tour through the incredible architecture of the nervous system. We're going to go piece by piece, so by the end, you'll have a really solid picture of how it's all put together, and more importantly, how it works.
So, here's our roadmap for this session. First, we'll cover the course introduction and goals, so you know exactly what to expect. Then, we'll get right into the main event with an overview of the central nervous system, the CNS. After that, we'll break down how it's organized to function. We'll learn the specific language of neuroanatomy, which is super important, and then we'll take a grand tour of the brain itself. To finish up, I'll share some fantastic resources to help you continue your journey.
All right, let's kick things off with the foundational elements of this module. We're going to start with what you'll be expected to learn, because these learning outcomes are the bedrock for everything we're about to cover.
Okay, these 10 points right here are your core competencies. By the time we're done, you'll be able to recognize and describe the major subdivisions of the CNS. You'll be able to do the same for the ventricular system and the cerebral spinal fluid that flows through it. We're going to cover the structures of sensory and motor systems and also the key structures associated with language. You'll learn how to classify cranial and spinal nerves, describe the limbic system, and even map out the entire blood supply of the CNS. But it's not just about naming parts. The last few goals are all about application. You'll be able to describe the development of the CNS and any congenital abnormalities, and, this is the big one, you'll apply all that anatomical knowledge to explain both normal CNS function and common clinical disorders.
Now this table lays out the weekly schedule. You can see how the lectures and the hands-on labs are paired up to really reinforce the concepts. Just so you know, all the lectures and practicals get started the week of January 20th, 2023. You can expect about 2 to 4 lectures each week, and you'll have a total of 6 practicals, each one an hour long, spread across the semester.
Okay, let's talk assessments. This is important, so pay close attention to your module code. If you're in ANU 22002, you'll have one continuous assessment worth 10% of your grade, and that's on March 19th, 2025. Then you'll have an end-of-module practical and a written exam. Now, if you're in MDU 22004, it's a bit different. Your assessment is broken into a neuroanatomy paper, worth 10%, and a neuroanatomy practical, also worth 10%. All right, with all the course logistics out of the way, let's dive into the really exciting stuff. We're going to start with a big picture overview of the central nervous system, or as we'll call it, the CNS. So what does the CNS actually do? Well, you can think of it as having 3 massive responsibilities. First, it is the absolute center of all our mental activity. Every thought, every lesson learned, every memory you have, that's the CNS. Second, it works hand in hand with the endocrine system to regulate and maintain homeostasis, which is just that delicate, perfect balance inside our bodies. And third, through this incredible network of receptors, the CNS keeps us plugged into our world, both the environment outside of us and the one inside of us.
So when we talk about the CNS, what are we actually looking at? This diagram shows you the 2 main components, the brain and the spinal cord, and you can see how well protected this whole system is. It's all housed inside the dorsal body cavity, with the skull, or cranium, acting as a helmet for the brain, and the vertebral column serving as armor for the spinal cord. It's also wrapped in 3 protective layers called the meninges.
Okay, we know what it is. Now let's look at how the nervous system is actually organized to get all its jobs done. It's a seriously impressive piece of biological engineering.
You know, at its core, the entire nervous system runs on this really simple but incredibly powerful 3-step loop. It all starts with sensory input. That's when receptors gather information from the world. That information then travels to the central nervous system for integration. That's the thinking part. And finally, the CNS sends out a command, the motor output, which causes a response, like making a muscle move. Input, process, output. That's the loop.
Let's get a bit more technical with those 3 stages. The sensory function is all about detecting stimuli and sending that information towards the CNS. The special nerve cells that do this are called afferent neurons. A good way to remember this is A for arriving at the CNS. Next, the integrative function. This happens inside the CNS and is handled by interneurons. This is where all the analysis, storage, decision-making, and perception happens. Finally, we have the motor function. This is when the CNS initiates a response, like muscle contraction. The commands are carried away from the CNS by efferent neurons. Just think E for exiting the CNS.
This flowchart really puts it all together beautifully. At the very top, you see the whole system is split into 2 main parts: the central nervous system, the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, the PNS. Now follow the arrows from the PNS.
It splits into two pathways. You've got the sensory or afferent division, which sends all the info to the CNS, and you have the motor or efferent division, which carries all the commands from the CNS. And that motor division splits again. You have the somatic system, which controls your voluntary movements, like kicking a ball, and the autonomic system, which handles all the involuntary stuff, like your heartbeat and digestion.
And this is just a brilliant, real-world example of that whole loop in action. So, the stimulus is a bear. Yikes! Your eyes, part of the sensory division of the PNS, send that bear signal to your CNS. Your brain, the CNS, processes this as a major threat. And then what happens? It sends out motor commands. The somatic nervous system tells your leg muscles to start running, now. And at the exact same time, the autonomic nervous system kicks in, cranking up your heart rate and getting your body ready for fight or flight. It's a perfectly synchronized, life-saving response.
Okay, before we can properly explore the brain, we have to learn the lingo. Neuroanatomy uses a very specific set of terms to describe locations and structures. Getting these down is absolutely essential.
These 6 terms are your bread and butter. Let's break them down. Inside the central nervous system, a cluster of neuron cell bodies is called a nucleus, and the bundle of wires or axons connecting them is called a tract. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, that same kind of cluster of cell bodies is called ganglia. For the wrinkly surface of the brain, think of it like a landscape. The elevated ridges or hills are called gyri. The shallow valleys between them are sulci. And if you have a really deep groove, like a canyon, that's a fissure.
This slide gives us 2 views that are absolutely crucial for getting our bearings. Let's look at the image on the left first. These are the directional terms for the brain. Rostral means towards the front, or anterior. Caudal means towards the back, or posterior. Dorsal points to the top, or superior. And ventral points to the bottom, or inferior. Now look at the cross-section on the right. Here you can actually see what we just learned. You can see the gyri, the sulci, and the fissures that create that famous folded surface of the brain.
All right, our vocabulary is set, we know our directions, now it's time for the main event. Let's begin our tour of the adult human brain, and we're going to start with its amazing outer layer, the cerebral cortex.
Let's just start with a sense of scale, because this is honestly mind-blowing. The total surface area of the cerebral cortex is a massive 2,200 square centimeters. If you were to flatten it all out, that's about 2.5 square feet of neural tissue. That is an enormous amount of processing power, and it's all packed neatly inside your skull.
So, the obvious question is, how on earth do you fit all of that surface area into such a small space? Well, the answer is in the brain's incredibly clever design, all those folds. Those gyri and sulci mean that about 2/3 of the entire cortex is actually tucked away hidden inside those grooves. It's a genius evolutionary trick to maximize our brain power.
Now, let's talk weight. The cortex itself weighs in at about 600 grams. That makes up a whopping 40% of the entire brain's weight. And as you can see from this chart, that weight is made up of 180 grams of neurons, the processing cells, and 420 grams of glial cells, which are the essential support cells of the nervous system.
So the brain isn't just one big blob. Each half of the cerebrum, what we call a cerebral hemisphere, is divided into 4 main lobes. You can see them color-coded here in this diagram. In red, you have the frontal lobe. In yellow, the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe is in green, and the occipital lobe is there in purple. And each one has its own set of specialized jobs.
So what do these lobes do? Well, think of the frontal lobe as the brain's CEO. It handles all the high-level decision-making and planning voluntary movements. It also contains Broca's area, which is critical for producing speech. The parietal lobe is like our internal GPS, processing sensory information and our spatial awareness. The temporal lobe, right by your temples, is a hub for processing memories and integrating them with all our senses. It also has Wernicke's area, which is key for understanding language. And finally, way at the back, the occipital lobe has one main job: vision. It's the brain's movie screen.
Okay, let's zoom out again and look at the brain's 5 major subdivisions. At the very top, we have the huge cerebrum with its 2 hemispheres. Tucked right underneath it is the diencephalon, which acts as a central relay station. That connects down to the brainstem, which is our body's life support system. Tucked in behind the brainstem is the cerebellum, which is absolutely vital for coordinating smooth movements. And finally, extending down from the brainstem is the spinal cord, the main information superhighway connecting the brain to the rest of the body. All right, to wrap things up, I want to leave you with some absolutely essential resources that will support you as you continue to learn this material. Here's your toolkit for success. For textbooks, Fitzgerald's Clinical Neuroanatomy and Neuroscience is fantastic, as is the Neuroanatomy Illustrated Color Text. For visuals, you can't beat Netter's Atlas of Human Anatomy. Online, sites like Radiopedia and Metapedia are great, but just be sure to use them carefully and critically. And please take full advantage of your university's tools, the weekly quizzes on Blackboard, the VR e-learning at the Nerve Center, and all the recordings and handbooks. But honestly, the most valuable resource you have is the practical sessions. Getting to work with 12 fresh cadaveric brains is an incredible, invaluable opportunity. So my best advice is simple. Be prepared, show up to everything, and always keep those learning outcomes in mind.
So we've just covered the fundamental map of the brain. But really, this is just the starting line. The real journey, the real magic, begins when you start connecting all these structures to the incredible things they let us do. To think, to feel, to create, to remember. So as we close, just think about this. After seeing this incredible architecture, what part of the brain's function are you most curious about? Because that curiosity, that's where the real learning begins. Thanks so much for joining me.